We are now joined by the fabulous Dr. Laura Tarzia, who is the Associate Professor in the Department of General Practice at the University of Melbourne. As we just hear, please indulge my wish to save time for the questions, so I request that you look up Laura's work online. You'll find that she is more than eminently qualified to talk about the subject of violence against older women, especially sexual violence. But Laura, before we get into all of that business, in line with Embolden's long-term vision of building respect for older people, can you please tell us about, older women in your life who have inspired you?
Yeah, I think it's hard to pick just one, but I think the types of older women that inspire me are ones who, in their various different fields, wherever they may be, who stand up for what they believe in, who don't take nonsense from anybody, and they don't care about other people's judgment or opinions, and they get on with what needs to be done.
Well, thank you, Laura. That's fantastic characteristics to look up to and to aspire to. I think those are especially important when we're looking at the issue of violence against older women, because they are so invisibilized, and especially sexual violence. So my question to you is, why is there so little attention paid to older women's experience of sexual violence?
Yeah, look, you're absolutely right, Yumi. It is a very invisible problem. And we've talked about domestic, family and sexual violence sort of collectively, but there are these particular challenges around the issue of sexual violence that are important to highlight, because it is sort of, more so even than other types of violence, I think, not talked about, and is kind of shrouded in these taboos and different issues. I mean, I think in a lot of Western cultures, to be honest, we sort of tend to have this societal gerontophobia. By that, I mean, like, we're uncomfortable with the idea of older women's sexuality, and we sort of struggle with the idea of older women as sexual beings. And, it's frequently sort of the subject of humor in popular culture, in movies and stuff like that. But by excluding older women from those kind of cultural portrayals of positive sexuality, then it becomes harder to believe that they might be the victims of sexual violence. So it's sort of a real issue there with our own discomfort and needing to address that on a societal level. Another issue, I mean, from a research perspective, which is where I'm coming from with this topic, is that sexual violence against older women sort of falls in between the cracks of a few different approaches. Got a lot of research on sexual violence, for example, comes from sort of a feminist perspective, and recently there's been more attention paid to the need for intersectionality. So we talk about sort of not just gender, but, cultural diversity and disability and things like that. But age really hasn't sort of found its way into that intersectional feminist discourse and into research. It tends to get ignored, even by a lot of feminists, which obviously is a big issue. But then on the other hand, the other way that it's approached in research is as a form of elder abuse, and it's kind of lumped together with all of these other types of abusive behaviours that people might perpetrate against an older person. Obviously domestic violence as well, but things like mugging, everyday sort of other crimes that might be perpetrated against an older person. It's all sort of pushed together under this umbrella of elder abuse. And the problem with doing that is that sexual violence becomes seen as something that's perpetrated against older women because they're old and not because they're women. And it kind of masks all of those sorts of social structures and gendered lens that we have on sexual violence when it's not about older women. All of that gets kind of brushed under the carpet and we don't talk about it. It's just sort of seeing older people as inherently vulnerable and, not recognizing a lot of that, the gender dynamics of that form of violence. And that's kind of been a bit of the dominant approach of what we see in Australia, and has informed a lot of policies that we have in this space. And that in turn has then had an impact on how we see it in the community. So it's sort of a flow-on effect. The other issue and sort of reason for why we don't talk about sexual violence against older women that much is because we just don't have good data on it that can help us understand the magnitude of the problem, what it looks like, what types of experiences older women are having, who the perpetrators are, all of these sorts of issues. And that's because surveys often just don't ask older women about this. And if they do, the questions are often framed in a way that can lead to underreporting of the problem. So, for example, the Australian Institute of Family Studies survey on elder abuse that came out a couple of years ago suggested that I think it was about 1% of participants recorded some type of sexual violence, and it asked about it, I think, in the last 12 months. And so it was saying things like forced you to engage in sexual acts against your will, I think was one of the questions. And that is not just unique to this survey. This is a broader issue, but it's highly likely that that survey is underreporting this issue. Studies do show that the way you ask the questions does impact on the prevalence that then comes out of them. So talking about force, for example, this is not just for older women. This is a bigger problem than that, but it's particularly, I think, relevant for older women just because of some of those, I guess, the ways that maybe many older women have been brought up to think about and talk about sex and particularly in a relationship or a marriage. And the language of force is probably not something that many of them would relate to. And so they're possibly going to answer no to some of those questions. And then we're going to see, this is a simplistic example, obviously, but it does matter that if you're talking about behaviours in a certain way and only asking about a limited range of behaviours and using a particular language, that people will say no. And so you get a lower prevalence than what might actually be present. The survey questions also don't really get at the sorts of psychological coercion that can happen in relationships around sex, and which broader studies do show are really, really common. So those intimate partner sexual coercive behaviours, blackmail, or, sulking, those types of emotional manipulation, those are often not captured in surveys, and I doubt they're captured in that particular elder abuse one. And so again, you'll see that probably in reality the prevalence is higher. Because I think there's no reason to suggest that those types of behaviours, which studies show are very common in younger cohorts, why would they just stop in older age? It doesn't really make a lot of sense to assume that somebody hits 60 and suddenly they're not experiencing these behaviours anymore. The other issue is that survey only asked about sexual violence perpetrated by somebody known to the victim survivor. And so there was not a lot of acknowledgement of sexual violence that might be perpetrated against older women by strangers or by somebody like a casual dating partner. So this idea that like older women might be on Tinder, they might be online dating, people don't think that is something that older women might do, even though research shows that many older women have very active sexual and dating lives. This is something that some older women do. And of course, like with anybody, there is sort of a risk with those types of encounters that you could be exposed to sexual violence, but people are not thinking about those types of things in relation to older women. We sort of only think about it as like the carer or the partner, which are definitely the more common things, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't think about the whole raft of behaviours and experiences that older women might have and think about ways we can address those in policy and practice.
So, Laura, right now, the highest profile case involving rape of an older woman is obviously that of Giselle Bellico in France. And she has said in court that her life has been destroyed, and she objected to the line of questioning by the defense lawyers who tried to implicate her in her own rape. So can you speak more to the impacts of sexual violence for older women and why it's so difficult for them to report it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, across the board, sexual violence is shown to be one of the most traumatic life events that someone can have. It's consistently associated with particularly mental health challenges, anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress. You know, the impacts are long-lasting, severe. There's an enormous burden on the healthcare system with a lot of chronic conditions that are underpinned by lifetime experiences of sexual violence. And, you know, we don't have good data, again, for older women to be able to conclusively say what the impacts are. But again, it's highly unlikely that they would be different. Just because somebody's older doesn't mean that these experiences aren't incredibly traumatic and don't cause the same sort of emotional impacts that they would to someone younger. There's a lot of emotional betrayal, particularly when the perpetrator is a partner. There can be huge amounts of self-blame and a sense of being dehumanized. And all of those impacts, I think, are not age-specific. You know, they're just, that is what the research shows that many victim survivors experience. And I mean, some research, and again, it's not strong, but there is some research out there that suggests that there are additional impacts even for victim survivors who are older. So there's been a few studies that have shown there's been things like increased risk of sexually transmitted infections and genital trauma, even some studies linking it with sort of increased cognitive decline. So, yeah, what evidence we do have definitely doesn't support this sort of myth that sexual violence is somehow less traumatic and harmful for older women than younger women.
I think, Laura, that's absolutely true. And what we found doing the research for our Hear Our Voices project is not only the trauma if the sexual assault is perpetrated now, but many older women carry, the burden of the trauma over their lifetime from being sexually assaulted when they're younger. So how can we improve our responses to sexual violence against older women?
Well, I think the first step is really this sort of raising awareness in the community and, events like this where we are talking about it, we're having the conversation, we're addressing the difficult issue and recognizing that this sexual violence can and does happen to older women. It's not just a younger women's problem. And recognizing, yes, there are, of course, impacts from lifetime sexual violence that might have happened when someone was younger and they're still carrying that trauma, but also that it happens to older women in older age. And I think it's really important that people do recognize that and move away from this sort of myth of the ideal rape victim, with the young, white, attractive woman walking alone at night in the dark alleyway, that sort of image that often the media latches onto, and recognizing that it can happen to older women too. And I think services definitely need to be aware and proactive about sensitive inquiry when they are seeing older women, particularly if someone is presenting with sort of an indicator or some sort of something that they've said or they're experiencing that makes you think that it could be underpinned by sexual violence, to always ask about that in a sensitive way. And that might be specialist services, it might be healthcare services, legal services, any services that are sort of responding and seeing older women. They need to be aware that this might be something they are seeing and just not recognizing. And definitely, I think there's a need for training and education in the aged care sector, understanding the dynamics of sexual violence and the different forms that it can take and what it can look like, and support with sort of distinguishing sexual coercion from consensual sexual activity, particularly when one or both of the people involved has dementia, and being able to respond to those disclosures in trauma-sensitive ways. I think that's a really important one. I know it's a bit self-serving, but I definitely think we need more research in this space. There just hasn't been enough. It's something that has been very neglected, I think, across the board, not just in Australia, but everywhere. More research into older women's experiences so that we can understand better how to support them effectively and what they actually want and need from services. The rapid review that came out recently on prevention did acknowledge that specifically sexual violence against older women was something that needed to be a priority, and that is fantastic to see. And I would very much like to see the national plan similarly acknowledge older women as a priority cohort, given that historically, they have been invisible in a lot of this work today.
Yes. So, and lastly, Laura, rather than being invisible, when you're 90 and riding your Harley Davidson, how would you like to be described?
Oh, yes, goodness. I really can't imagine myself riding a Harley, but you never know. You never know. Look, I definitely think that for me, if I'm 90 riding my Harley, I'll be happy if people remember me as somebody who did meaningful work to improve the lives of women and girls, and, was passionate about what she does. And like I said at the beginning, with those older women that inspire me, I would like to be seen as someone who didn't just accept setbacks, that, kept pushing forward and kept striving for a more equal society.
Thank you, Laura. You can join the Raging Incrementalist Club then. Thank you. Thank you for giving us your time today. Thank you.